This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Great to be with you again, Sam, as always.
It's always a pleasure, Richard, and we'll let our listeners know to be looking forward to next week. Not that this week isn't good, and I know what you're going to say is going to be profound and deep.
As
and
always.
Thought-provoking and challenging.
To say the least.
To say nothing of the
go on.
of the way in which it was delivered and the humor that is interjected throughout.
But next week we've got a special guest. Again, we're going to have a series of special guests coming up here in the next number of episodes.
Yeah, so tell us who do we have on deck?
I'm particularly excited about next week because we are going to be having none other than the chaplain to the Buffalo Sabres hockey team. And so Kevin Beers, and looking forward to that. He's just kind of getting some insights into how do you minister to professional athletes. And so,
well, and it's interesting because you're in a venue as an official religious person, and that organization is not religious. And so that would be.
So every, like for the hockey teams, it so much depends on the general manager. You know, if he's really hostile toward religion, you're not going to have much access. And also these players, they're always being hit up by autograph seekers and picture takers and interviewers, and so they're kind of a little bit guarded. Like, well, what do you want from me? And so to build the kind of trust where you can just be there and a resource, and the trusted resource, Christian guide takes a special kind of person. I think I've watched Kevin in action. I watched him dealing with Sabres players, and I've watched him after games and before games, and he does a great job. And he also has done a lot of devotions and things for the Buffalo Bills football team as well. So anyway, that's coming up next week.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that. But before we get there, we are in a series of our own.
Yeah. Forget about the Sabres for a moment. We're in Luke.
We are. Luke chapter 9.
And we talked about discipleship, which is such a key thing. It's always been for the last 2,000 years, but people recently are just saying they feel like we've got to get back to that. It's not about just big church rallies or citywide rallies. Those all can be fine. But when Jesus launched his worldwide movement, it was not how many citywide rallies can we hold or Christian programming can we get on the air.
Yeah.
It was go out and make disciples one by one of all the nations. And so what does that look like? And so we've been looking for a couple of weeks at Luke chapter 9 because a great prototype is just looking at how Jesus walked with the 12 and what did he do with them. And so we've looked at, for 2 weeks, we started in Luke 9, verse 1, and we made all the way to verse 7 today.
Wow.
And our third week,
really
I promise we're going to try to speed it up if we can here.
Yeah, I will say, if you're just tuning into this episode, this is part 3 of an undetermined number of episodes, but there's 2 parts that come before this. And
if you're in a Bible study I teach on Sundays, Sam, but my style, I enjoy just walking through a passage and just pulling stuff out. And so if you enjoy that too, and you missed the first 2 episodes, you may want to catch that as well. And maybe, I try to just demonstrate kind of as I'm reading through a chapter, what I look for, what I pull out. And so we'll do a bit of that again today. And so Luke 9, verse 7 says, Herod, the tetrarch, sometimes he's called a king, but technically at this point, he's not really an official king. He's actually a Roman official and over a Roman region. But it says Herod the Tetrarch heard about everything that was going on. He was perplexed because some said that John had been raised from the dead. So Herod has already had John beheaded, and then all of a sudden this guy is preaching and teaching much like John, which I'm sure may have caused some consternation. Some that Elijah had appeared, and others that one of the ancient prophets had risen. I beheaded John, Herod said, but who is this I hear such things about? And he wanted to see him. Now, it's kind of an interesting little aside there, because Jesus has sent out his disciples preaching the kingdom of God. And so this may even be at a time when Jesus is by himself, or at least he's without his 12 disciples. And then word comes back. You're sure that, people are going to relay messages or what they heard. And Herod is saying, I'd really like to meet this Jesus and see him. This is interesting to me because, of course, if Jesus were doing things the way that we tend to do them today, he might have thought, hey, well, that's great. If the king or the tetrarch wants to hear the gospel, maybe
what an opportunity.
Yeah, maybe get some exposure. Maybe he'll leverage some influence. He'll open some doors. Maybe he'll let us speak in a local arena.
Which to me makes me think of that's sort of the Paul model. You think, it's like, hey, well, Paul would certainly take on the whoever and just say, hey, well, this is an opportunity for the gospel.
And there were times where Paul could be fairly effective with some of the leaders, regional guys that he talked to, and he's boldly would speak to kings or whoever. But Jesus, there's no record that Jesus ever responds to that. Never reaches out and says, let's try to reach these, influence these political leaders for good and for the kingdom. It's just not Jesus' way. And I'm not saying that you never try to reach a politician or you never try to exert influence, but if you put your hope in that, oftentimes I've found that trying to court politicians is simply a distraction. Mm-hmm. And you really have a sense that that's what this would have been. And I think Jesus clearly knew that there's maybe curiosity on Herod's part, but not conviction. This guy's not open to changing anything. He's basically murdered an innocent man, and out of curiosity, he wants, there are some people, it's just probably better to stay off their radar and not bother to even give them too much attention, because they're just going to have evil designs. They're going to want to manipulate you. I could imagine Herod trying to pressure Jesus into supporting his plans and his thoughts, and maybe endorsing or affirming that what he had done, committing adultery basically with his brother's wife, was that's what got John beheaded. And I imagine Jesus wouldn't have fared much better. He certainly wouldn't have compromised and told Herod what he wanted to hear. And so Jesus just doesn't waste his time with that. And again, I'm not saying that if you become politically involved that it's a waste of time, but as a disciple of Jesus, I think it is wise to be very careful that you don't start putting your trust in politicians. Yeah. To accomplish things God has a different way of accomplishing.
And that, I feel like there's a huge movement right now to sort of combine sort of religion and politics. Yeah. It's sort of a broadly speaking, but I think a lot of people have confused conservatism with Christianity, and I think we see that more and more, just sort of in the public sphere, and this would probably be an entirely different episode on its own, but sort of that, detangling some of that we see, and even good meaning churchgoers and even disciples getting kind of caught up, or maybe putting their hope in, or thinking that using politics as a strategy somehow for the gospel.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, there's nothing wrong with trying to get good people elected to office and passing good legislation and so on that's good for the country. But if you want to see people's morals change, you can't really legislate that. You can't pass a law and then everybody starts acting more morally. It's that requires heart change. And so the long run best approach is change people one by one as they're born again, as they find Christ and they're discipled to live a Christ-like way. We're always kind of looking for shortcuts in the Christian life, and just simply getting some politician to legislate some moral lifestyle is very, very surface, and it doesn't go to the heart. And so Jesus is not distracted by that. It's clearly it would just be a political distraction to Jesus, and he doesn't waste his time on it. But then you get down to verse 10, and this is a fascinating story just to look at for a moment or two. It says, when the apostles returned, so these 12 disciples now have returned. They went out 2 by 2. They're preaching the kingdom of God in all the surrounding villages, and then they're finished their assignment. They all return. You can imagine kind of the excitement as they're reporting back to Jesus, the miracles they accomplished, the people that responded favorably to their preaching, and they reported to Jesus all that they had done. And so he took them along and withdrew privately to a town called Bethsaida. So we see this over and over again with Jesus. He basically does 3 primary things with his disciples. First, he teaches them. He always gives them truth and content, and then he sends them out. He said, now go practice what I've just preached. And so, which I think is something that's often missing in the church today. We do a lot of teaching and preaching, but we don't always involve a lot of practicing, where you say, okay, you've heard enough, now go practice what you've heard. And I was sharing this morning on a Zoom call that, if you went to church every week for a year and you heard one sermon, you would hear 52 sermons in a year. And oftentimes sermons have several points to them, but let's assume they just had 1 point each. Then if you heard one truth every sermon that you now needed to embrace and practice, you got 52 things you need to incorporate into your life. That's a lot of change in a year. Just 52 things, and a lot of sermons, and sometimes we hear a lot more than just one presentation in a week. So, and so what typically happens is there's a lot of Christians who are just overloaded with content that they're not practicing yet. And now they're going to hear 3 more Bible studies this week to add to the content that they're not practicing already. And so Jesus would only teach so much before he would say, you've already heard more than you're practicing. So get out there and practice this. And so they would do that. And then the third thing they would do is they would process. So he basically would preach, and then he'd have them practice, and then they would process. And when they came back, he would typically go to some private place, and he would say, okay, now let's talk through what you experienced. Yeah. And again, we don't typically do that in church. We may say you should go be a witness. A lot of times we don't do anything more than just say it on Sunday, and then come back next week, we'll tell you some more you should do. But Jesus would say, no, go do it. I've told you enough. Now go practice this. And then when they did practice it, he'd sit them down and say, well, what happened when you did? And what were your problems? What surprises did you face? Where did you fail? Where were you successful? And let's learn from that. And then after they processed a while, Jesus would transition and start teaching some more and presenting them with more content. And so Jesus is in the process of this. He's pulled his disciples aside, and they're processing, they're resting. And it says in verse 11, when the crowds found out, they followed him. And I'll tell you what, if these disciples are really excited and we're with Jesus, we're going to get some one-on-one time here to really talk through things. And then the next thing you know, crowds of people are gathering. I can imagine just feeling a little frustrated. Like, can we just have a day to ourselves here? Like, we've been on the road for who knows how long, and we're just now getting back with Jesus. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. But it says a crowd gathers, and so Jesus welcomed them. You never get a sense that Jesus is frustrated that people want his time. That he never has these deep sighs like, oh, there's the public again. We got to get out there, and will these people never leave me alone? You don't ever hear him say that kind of thing. And so it says he welcomed them, spoke to them about the kingdom of God. And of course, we've seen this before. He doesn't talk to them about the church. He talks about the kingdom. And of course, the kingdom includes the churches, but the kingdom is bigger. It's broader than that. And he's talking about God's rule on earth. And then it says he also healed those who needed healing. And it's always strikes me when you see that it doesn't say Jesus healed those who had sufficient faith. It doesn't say he healed those who were true followers. It says if they needed healing, he healed them, which again is interesting. It's not necessarily in line with the kind of theology I sort of grew up with. He healed everybody, it sounds like, or at least those he felt needed healing. And so he's healing and he's teaching the kingdom of God. But it says, late in the day, the 12 approached and said to him, send the crowd away so that they can go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find food and lodging because we are in a deserted place. So I've talked about this before, but basically what the disciples do is they come up with a plan. And they look at all these people and they realize that they're going to be hungry, they're going to need to eat, they don't have sufficient food to feed them themselves. It's getting late. If they wait much longer, it's going to be dark, and these people will be walking around in the countryside at night. They may be pillaging people's farmland and who knows what fruit trees and things they may be trying to find food from, and that's not going to be good. And so the disciples look at this pending problem and they come up with a solution. And that's what leaders do. They solve problems and they've come up with a solution. And so they're basically, if you will, they're praying to Jesus. They're talking to Jesus and asking him to bless their plans. So instead of the disciples can't really just send the people away. So they come up to Jesus and say, Jesus, this is what we need you to do. We've got a plan. All you need to do is bless our plan. Just go along with our plan and everything's good. But Jesus responds, you give them something to eat, he told them. And of course, that's going to cause some consternation because they know that they can't afford it. And, sometimes I think Jesus will do that. We'll pray and say, God, would you fix that problem? And Jesus might say, well, you go be the source of the solution. Jesus, can you make that better? Well, Richard, you go make that better.
Yeah.
Would you bring comfort to that person? Well, Richard, why don't you go comfort that person? Sometimes he pushes back, and it's just easier to pray for someone than to be a part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And so they said, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, they said, unless we go and buy food for all these people. For about 5,000 men were there. And so now Jesus is asking them to do the impossible. And of course, you know this, but this is the only miracle that all 4 Gospels record, the only one. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead after 4 days. You'd think all the Gospels would tell that story. There's some pretty big miracles that he performs that all 4 Gospels don't record. This is the only one. And so that tells you that the disciples always viewed this one as particularly impressive, to have that many people fed with just a small little lunch for a little boy, and then to multiply it that many times over. And it is interesting as he breaks this bread and breaks the fish. He could have just created out of nothing, if you will. I mean, he could have just reached into an empty basket and kept pulling out more fish and loaves.
Pulled a Mary Poppins magic bag of never-ending loaves.
What is interesting with this is that Jesus starts with something. He doesn't just pull it out of thin air. He takes these little loaves, these little fishes, and then he breaks it and he multiplies it. He blesses it, and out of the little that they had, he produces enough. And I've often thought to myself, that's interesting, because sometimes when we have a need, God could just out of the blue provide everything we need, but oftentimes he's going to take the little that you do have and he's going to grow it. He's going to build on it. And that's why I think partly also why Jesus says, if you're faithful with a little, he'll give you more. And so sometimes we just want something entirely new and fresh and almost out of nothing. And God, of course, can do that. But it just seems that one of his ways of doing things is to take what we have, however little, and then helping that become enough. And it's an interesting kind of approach.
If you've ever wondered how to ask the right questions to help move people onto God's agenda, then consider attending Blackaby Ministries' Spiritual Leadership Coaching Workshop, April 17th to the 19th at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia. Not only is there great teaching at this workshop, but you will also get to practice what you learn. Use code EARLYBIRD at checkout for a special discount. To find out more and to register, visit blackabycoaching.org/workshop. Links will be in the show notes.
It is interesting. It says that he told his disciples, have them sit down in groups of about 50 each. And Jesus is organizing them. This is a miracle. You think, how organized do you have to be to just perform a miracle? But there's something very orderly about how Jesus does this. And he's making it efficient. Groups of 50. He's got these 12 disciples who are going to all be carrying baskets of food around. And he's got the groups kind of, cordoned off. Maybe each basket can help feed up to 50 people or something. And Jesus got this figured out. Sometimes you just think, if you're going to do a miraculous miracle, how organized do you have to be? Just keep cranking out the food. But there's something orderly about the ways of God.
I think it's clear that Jesus wasn't Baptist, because if it had been a Baptist miracle, then it would have been a buffet line.
Yeah.
And all 5,000 of those people would have had to come. And that's so inefficient.
Yeah, it is.
I like this.
Yeah, you divided by 12 this way, much more efficient. And it says, then he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke them. He basically thanked God for what hadn't happened yet. He's thanking God before the miracle, which is faith, obviously. And what I found that God does is he basically took what this one little boy had, and he blessed what he had, and then he broke what he had. And I think sometimes if we want God to truly use us in our little church, our little ministry, our limited skills, sometimes what God has to do is he's got to break us first, and then we begin to be multiplied. I know some churches that don't want to be changed. They don't want to be broken. They don't want their programming to be broken. They just want bigger results. And sometimes God would say, well, no, first I'm going to have to break what is here, and then I'm going to multiply it and bless it as a result. And so he blesses it, he breaks it, and then it says he kept giving them to the disciples to set before the crowd. So just that idea of continual motion, and as fast as one disciple would come back with an empty basket, Jesus would fill that basket up, and off the disciple would go again. And keeping 12 disciples busy, distributing food to feed 5,000 men and their families. And I don't know how tiring it is, like ripping bread up to feed 5,000 men and their families. Like, even if it's a miracle, I'm guessing that's got to be tiresome. You're tearing bread, tearing fish. And then finally it says, everyone ate and was filled. And they picked up 12 baskets of leftover pieces, leftovers. And I'll tell you what, is there anything better than leftovers? But what does that tell you? It's, of course, I've said before, but my favorite verse in the Bible is Ephesians 3:20. That says that Jesus is able to do exceedingly abundantly more than we could ever ask or think. And of course, the disciples had asked, just send the crowd away. And what Jesus could have done is said, well, you guys are asking in faith, you're asking in unity, all 12 of you want the same thing, you believe I can send them away, and you're sincere about this, so I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to just grant your request. What if Jesus had granted their request and sent the multitude away? Of course, the disciples would have felt like they were successful. They would have said, wow, we prayed in faith, believing, and sure enough, we got exactly what we asked for. But of course, Ephesians 3:20 says God is able to do exceedingly abundantly more than we could ever ask for, or even think to ask for. And of course, this is a prime example of they're just wanting to do crowd control, and Jesus is preparing to do a miracle that people will still be talking about 2,000 years later. And so I have to look and say, when I'm leading, when I'm ministering, am I simply trying to come up with a plan and then asking God to bless it? And if so, it may not be much different than the disciples sending the crowd away. Or am I going to God and saying, God, what is it that's on your heart to do? Because obviously Jesus knew probably from the beginning that day he was preparing to do an incredible miracle. And then he gets all these puny requests from his disciples. And Jesus just loved the crowd too much to give them the little that the disciples were asking for. And I've had to just say, Lord, every time I'm praying for my kids, my grandkids, whoever it might be, and I'm, without even realizing it, I'm asking for just so little for them. But God, if you're wanting to give them a lot more, then just please cancel my request. Just ignore my mindless babbling that I'm doing right now in prayer, and just help upgrade my praying to the level that you want to give. I would hate to rob my family because I asked for way less than what God wanted to give, and God said, all right, if that would satisfy you, Richard, if that's enough. I intended to do exceedingly abundantly more, but you seemed like you'd be satisfied with just this little. And you just have to wonder if, when you see this many churches across America, this many Christians, and then not having a greater influence on America today, you just wonder, could it be that all we're seeing happen is what we come up with, what our plans are, and nobody is seeing 5,000 men fed with their families. They're just seeing the crowd control that we're coming up with. And maybe it's time to change that around. Instead of asking God to bless our plans, maybe we need to stop and say, well, God, what are your plans? Let me align my life with those, and then see things happening in and through my life that can only be explained by Almighty God.
Well, that's a very convicting word, Richard, and I think we would all be better off aligning our lives with what God intends for us, and not being so short-sighted and little-minded to only ask for the best thing that we can think of at the time. So thank you for taking us through part 3 of this undetermined,
part 4 is coming.
undetermined length of discipleship series, and we look forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.